The boardroom on the 42nd floor of the Nexicor Tower was built to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling glass on three sides, a skyline that swallowed the horizon, and a conference table made of single-slab Italian marble, white as bone, cold as judgment. 14 leather chairs surrounded it, each occupied by someone whose annual salary could fund a small country's education budget. On the wall behind the head chair, the Nexicor logo glowed in brushed silver, a stylized arrow pointing upward, forever frozen in its promise of ascent. The irony of that arrow would not become apparent until much, much later. That morning, the company's entire future had been compressed into a single meeting. Nexicor Digital Solutions had once been the darling of the tech sector, a mid-sized firm that had moved fast, burned bright, and spent with a recklessness that felt, for 3 remarkable years, like confidence. Now, the runways were short. The burn rate had outpaced revenue by a margin that made the CFO, a careful man named Robert Haynes, lose sleep every night. They needed a capital injection. $200 million, to be precise. And today was the day the investor was supposed to arrive. Victoria Caldwell entered the boardroom exactly 4 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to begin. She never arrived last. That was for people who needed an entrance. She arrived early enough to already be seated when others walked in, so that the room came to her, not the other way around. At 39, Victoria was the kind of woman who made rooms recalibrate when she entered, not because she was loud, but because she was precise. Every element of her appearance had been curated with the same cold discipline she applied to quarterly earnings reports. Her charcoal Armani blazer, the single row of diamonds at her collarbone, hair pulled back in a way that communicated control, not effort. She had built Nexicor from a 40-person startup into a company of over 1,800 employees. And she wore that fact on her face the way some people wear grief, visibly, permanently, and as a shield. Her executives filed in behind her. Chief Financial Officer Robert Haynes, Chief Operating Officer Dana Whitmore, Chief Marketing Officer Greg Lassiter, and 7 members of the board. They arranged themselves with the practiced choreography of people who had learned, over years of proximity to Victoria Caldwell, exactly where they were permitted to sit and precisely what expression to hold. Nobody laughed unless she laughed first. Nobody frowned unless the numbers warranted it. The room was hers, and everyone inside it understood that completely. The investor was scheduled for 10 o'clock. At 2 minutes past 10, the elevator doors opened, and a man stepped into the reception area just beyond the glass boardroom wall. Victoria noticed him immediately, not because his presence commanded attention, but because it conspicuously failed to. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, solidly built, with silver threading through dark hair that needed, in Victoria's estimation, a better barber. He wore a navy blue blazer that fit adequately but not exceptionally, a white button-down shirt with no tie, and dark trousers that were clean but unremarkable. His shoes, and Victoria always noticed, shoes were plain black leather Oxfords, scuffed lightly at the toe. He carried no briefcase, no portfolio. No assistant trailed behind him. He had arrived alone, in what the parking attendant downstairs would later confirm was a 7-year-old gray Ford sedan. His name, the receptionist had noted on the sign-in sheet in ordinary ballpoint pen, was Martin Webb. Victoria watched Martin Webb through the glass as he was escorted toward the boardroom door. And in the 3 seconds it took for him to cross that threshold, she had already made her assessment. She was not a cruel woman. She would have told you then. She was simply realistic. And the reality, as she read it through the lens of 2 decades of corporate survival, was that Martin Webb did not look like $200 million. He looked like a man who might inspect a property before a modest renovation. He looked like someone's uncle, at a work function. Pleasant, unremarkable, slightly out of place. He was escorted in by her assistant, a 26-year-old named Sophie Chen, who had worked for Victoria for 8 months, and had, in that time, developed a finely tuned instinct for when the temperature in any given room was about to drop. Sophie felt it drop the moment Victoria's eyes tracked to Martin Webb. Martin walked to the table without hesitation. He had the unhurried posture of a man who had walked into many rooms and had never required them to rearrange themselves for his comfort. He stopped at the seat across from Victoria, and before sitting, he extended his right hand across the table. It was a simple gesture, open palm, slight lean forward, the universal grammar of professional greeting. The kind of handshake that costs nothing and means everything. Victoria Caldwell looked at the hand, She held her gaze there for precisely long enough to make it a statement. Then she tilted her head in a slight, economical nod, the kind you might give a waiter who had correctly identified your table, and redirected her eyes to the presentation binder in front of her. Martin's hand remained extended for one more second, then two. Then he lowered it slowly and sat down. At the far end of the table, Greg Lassiter covered his mouth with two fingers. Beside him, a board member named Harrison Drake made a barely audible sound that was unmistakably a suppressed laugh. Dana Whitmore stared at her notepad. Robert Haynes looked at the ceiling. The room was full of people who had seen exactly what had just happened and had chosen, each in their own practiced way, to be somewhere else. Martin Webb said nothing. He folded his hands on the marble table and waited. Victoria launched into the presentation with the crisp efficiency of a woman who had given this exact pitch 43 times in 18 months and had refined it to a surgical instrument. Slides moved. Revenue projections appeared. Market share graphs ascended toward a future that required, as a prerequisite, the $200 million currently sitting across from her in a scuffed pair of Oxford shoes. She was brilliant. She was thorough. She was undeniably, formidably impressive. And through all of it, Martin Webb listened without interrupting, without nodding vigorously, without performing the theater of engagement that most people offered during a pitch to signal their interest. He simply watched. His expression was unreadable, not bored, not hostile, not impressed, just present, observing. At the end of the presentation, when Victoria closed her binder and the room settled into the particular quiet of a pitch that has just concluded, Martin spoke for the first time. His voice was low and even, the voice of a man who had never needed to raise it to be heard. He said, "I think you just made a very expensive mistake." Victoria held his gaze. "I'm sorry?" The faintest crease at the corner of his eyes. "I didn't say I was sorry," he replied. And then he stood, buttoned the middle button of his navy blazer, and walked out of the boardroom with the same unhurried calm with which he had entered it. The door closed behind him without a sound. For a full 4 seconds, no one in the room spoke. No one moved. The silver arrow on the wall continued to point upward, frozen in its lie. To understand what Victoria Caldwell had done in that boardroom, it is necessary to understand what Victoria Caldwell had been before the boardroom existed. She had grown up in Millfield, a small working-class town in central Ohio, where the primary employers were a textile factory that had been dying slowly since the 1980s, and a chain supermarket that recycled its workforce every 18 months. Her father had worked at the textile plant for 22 years before his back gave out, and the plant gave nothing back. Her mother cleaned houses. Victoria had worn the same 3 pairs of jeans to school for an entire semester in 7th grade. And she had watched with the acute, humiliating precision that only a child can feel as the girls with new shoes noticed, and noticed again, and noticed until it became a kind of sport. She had been smart enough to earn a scholarship to a state university, then smart enough to turn that into a graduate degree in business from a school with a name that opened doors. She had been ferocious about it, the kind of ferocity that doesn't come from ambition alone, but from the specific, bone-deep terror of going back, of being small again, of being the girl with the same 3 pairs of jeans. By the time she was 32, she had built her first company. By 35, she had sold it. By 37, she was running Nexicor. Somewhere in the arc of that trajectory, something had calcified inside her. The fear of smallness had transformed, with the alchemy of success, into contempt for it. She had clawed her way out of insignificance, and somewhere along the way she had come to believe that insignificance was a choice that people who appeared unimpressive had, on some fundamental level, chosen to appear that way. That the external markers of success, the clothes, the car, the office, the altitude of one's floor, were not vanity, but vocabulary, the language in which serious people identified each other. She had rebuilt her entire identity in that language, and she had become fluent, and she was not willing to accept that the language might be wrong. Her executives were afraid of her, in the way that people are afraid of weather, not because she was violent, but because she was unpredictable, and powerful, and entirely indifferent to whether her effects on people were fair. She had fired a director of product development for wearing sneakers to a client meeting. She had publicly corrected a senior engineer's grammar in an all-hands address. She had, on 3 separate occasions, sent back meals at business dinners not because the food was wrong but because the gesture established hierarchy. Her team had learned to preempt her, to second-guess her, to sand down every rough edge before it reached her. They had, in doing so, also learned to stop telling her the things she didn't want to hear. Sophie, her assistant, had been the one to find the business card. It had slipped from Martin Webb's jacket pocket as he stood to leave a small cream-colored rectangle that landed near the leg of his chair. Unnoticed in the silence that followed his exit, Sophie had picked it up during the room reset, turned it over, and felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her feet. The card was plain. Matte cream stock. Embossed lettering. No logo, except a simple geometric mark in the corner, understated in the way that only truly expensive things are understated. The name on the card was Martin Webb. Below it, in small clean letters, founder and managing director, Webb Capital Group. Sophie knew that name. Anyone who had spent more than 6 months in the financial sector knew that name. Webb Capital Group had assets under management exceeding $14 billion. It had backed 11 unicorn companies in the past 7 years. It had the kind of track record that made institutional investors send handwritten letters requesting meetings. Sophie stood in the empty boardroom, holding the card, and felt the particular cold of knowing something that was going to change everything and being the last person in the building who still didn't know what to do about it. The research took Robert Haynes and his team 40 minutes. They did not need longer. Because the information was not hidden, it was simply that no one had thought to look for it before the meeting, because the meeting had been arranged through a third-party intermediary firm, and somewhere in the chain of introductions, the full identity of the prospective investor had been communicated as Mr. Martin Webb, private equity, and everyone had assumed that private equity meant hedge fund middle management, not the architect of one of the most successful investment vehicles of the past 2 decades. By the time Robert walked into Victoria's office with the research printout, his face had the look of a man carrying a detonator he was not sure how to set down safely. Martin Webb had started his career as an analyst at a mid-tier investment bank in his late 20s. He had left in his early 30s with almost no fanfare, pooled money from a small group of long-term relationships, and begun making bets that most of his contemporaries considered eccentric. He had been right, steadily and spectacularly, for over 20 years. Webb Capital Group now employed 260 people across offices in 4 cities. Martin Webb himself gave almost no interviews, attended almost no industry galas, maintained almost no social media presence, and was known, among the people who knew him best, for 2 things: an extraordinary ability to assess organizational culture during a single meeting, and an absolute, non-negotiable insistence on working only with people he respected. He had walked away from potentially transformative deals before. He had done it without apology and without regret, and he had never, in anyone's professional memory, been publicly dismissed at a table he had been invited to sit at. Victoria read the profile once, set it down, and said nothing for a long time. The room was quiet. The skyline behind her window looked, in that particular moment, less like promise and more like distance. She said, finally, "Arrange a private meeting." "Today." Robert looked at his hands. "I already reached out," he said, "through the intermediary and directly to their office." Victoria waited. Robert said, "Their response was, Webb Capital Group does not engage in business relationships with organizations whose leadership demonstrates a lack of basic professional respect." The silence that followed was of a different quality entirely. Victoria read the response again, in her head, and still could not fully absorb it. Not because she didn't understand the words, but because she had spent 17 years building a version of herself that was impervious to this exact kind of reckoning, and the version of events in which a man in scuffed shoes could dismantle it with a single refusal to shake hands had simply never been a scenario she had permitted herself to imagine. It began, as these things always begin, not as a flood, but as a leak. A whisper between 2 analysts on the 14th floor. A text message between board members. By the following morning, it had spread through the company's internal channels with the quiet speed of bad news that everyone has been waiting for permission to believe. The Webb Capital funding was not coming. $200 million, the oxygen that was supposed to keep the company breathing through the next 18 months, had been withdrawn before the ink was anywhere near a term sheet. The stock market noticed before the official announcement. Nexicor's share price opened down 6%. By noon, it was down 11%. The phones in the investor relations office rang continuously, and the answers given were carefully worded and completely insufficient. By 3 in the afternoon, a prominent financial news outlet had published a story under the headline, "Nexicor's funding crisis deepens as key investor pulls out." The story cited sources who described a meeting that had gone badly. It did not yet name the incident with the handshake. That particular detail was still 24 hours away from being public. But people inside the building already knew. The effect on morale was immediate and devastating. Nexicor had been running on fumes and optimism for 6 months, and its employees, most of whom were smart enough to have read the underlying financials without being told what they meant, had been holding on to the narrative of the coming capital injection, the way people hold on to a rope over a very long drop. Now the rope had been cut. Procurement sent a memo about discretionary spending freezes. A planned product launch was quietly pushed back. In the engineering department, 3 senior developers updated their professional profiles within 48 hours. 2 accepted calls from recruiters they had previously ignored. The rumors about layoffs moved through the open plan office like weather. You could see it in the way people stopped making eye contact in the kitchen, in the way conversations stopped when certain names were mentioned, in the way the usually crowded Friday afternoon beer cart sat largely untouched. At the executive table, the atmosphere was different. It was not panic, because executives are trained to project forward motion, even when there is none. It was something more like controlled terror, dressed in the language of strategy. Several members of the board had already made calls they would later describe as exploratory. Dana Whitmore, the COO, had begun to make notes in a private document she saved under a name that meant nothing. Greg Lassiter had stopped defending Victoria in conversations where he previously would have. Robert Haynes, who had known Victoria for 8 years and respected her more than almost anyone, sat at his desk that afternoon and said to no one in particular, "She didn't lose a deal. She showed us something we've been ignoring for years." Victoria, for her part, spent the day in her office. She took calls. She reviewed strategy documents. She spoke in the steady, authoritative register of a CEO who has not been diminished. But her assistant Sophie, who brought her a coffee at 2:15 and a sparkling water at 4:30, could see in the way that proximity teaches you to see that something had shifted. The absolute certainty that Victoria Caldwell wore like a second skin had developed, in the space of 36 hours, a hairline fracture. When Victoria spoke to Robert that afternoon, she still held the line that the incident had been a minor miscalculation, that the reaction had been disproportionate, that no single handshake could or should determine the fate of a $250 million capital decision. Robert listened to all of it, and when she finished, he said quietly, "He didn't withdraw because of the handshake, Victoria. He withdrew because in that 30 seconds, he saw exactly who you are when you think the stakes are low." Victoria said nothing. Robert picked up his folder and left. Sophie, standing just outside the door, heard everything. Martin Webb was, at the moment the Nexicor story began its slow public unraveling, sitting in his actual office, which was, to the particular astonishment of anyone who had formed a mental image based on the size of his portfolio, a medium-sized room in a converted brick building in a modest commercial district 6 miles from the downtown towers. The building had a coffee shop on the ground floor and a small civil engineering firm on the third. Webb Capital's offices occupied the second floor entirely but without extravagance. Clean lines, good light, substantial bookshelves, and the kind of furniture that had been chosen for comfort rather than impression. There was no lobby designed to make visitors feel small. There was no view intended to remind guests of their altitude. There were simply rooms where thoughtful people did good work, and a kitchen where someone had recently made a vegetable soup that still faintly scented the air. Martin was the father of 2 daughters, aged 17 and 11, both of whom lived with him full-time since his divorce 4 years prior. He drove a practical car because he drove his daughters to school and to soccer practice and to the orthodontist, and a practical car made those logistical demands easier. He wore unremarkable clothes to initial meetings, not because he had forgotten how to dress, but because he had, over 23 years of investing, developed a methodology he described to no one outside his closest colleagues, as the character audit. It was simple, and it was devastatingly effective. He dressed ordinarily. He arrived without theater. He offered a handshake, and then he watched. Not for intelligence, he could assess that from the materials he received in advance. Not for competence, the numbers spoke to that. He watched for the thing that numbers couldn't capture, how the person at the head of that table treated someone they believed to be beneath them. He had met brilliant people who treated their assistants like furniture and their junior employees like liabilities. And he had learned, at significant cost early in his career, that those people were bad investments regardless of the brilliance. He had also met ordinary-seeming people with modest presentations who turned out to possess the kind of organizational character that built something lasting. Victoria Caldwell had given him everything he needed to know in the first 45 seconds. He had stayed for the full presentation not out of uncertainty but out of professional courtesy. He had not yet made peace with the decision, and he wanted to be fair. The presentation had been genuinely impressive. It had also done nothing to change what he had already seen. He had seen the refusal of the handshake. He had seen the almost imperceptible smirk from the man at the far end of the table. He had seen the executive beside him look away. He had seen a room full of presumably intelligent people perform complicity in a casual act of contempt. And he had recognized it not as rudeness, exactly, but as culture. This was what this organization was. This was what it valued. And he was being asked to anchor $200 million to it. That evening, sitting at his kitchen table while his younger daughter worked on a school project nearby, he reviewed the security footage that the intermediary had. With his prior authorization captured of the boardroom, he watched Victoria's eyes track to his hand. He watched the calibrated pause. He watched the nod that substituted for a greeting. He watched the laughter at the far end of the table, small, covered, but unmistakable. His daughter, without looking up from her project, asked, "Are you okay, Dad?" He said, "Yeah, sweetheart, just thinking." She said, "You make that face when something disappoints you." He looked at her. She was 11, and she was right. He closed the laptop, and within the hour, he had instructed his team to redirect the capital to a competitor, a smaller firm named Viridian Systems, that had impressed him 6 months earlier, that had a product in an adjacent space, and that had, in every meeting he'd attended, treated every person in the room with exactly the same degree of professional regard, regardless of title, tenure, or the quality of their footwear. The Viridian announcement broke on a Tuesday. It was a brief press release. Web Capital Group confirms a significant strategic investment in Viridian Systems to support expansion of its enterprise analytics platform, but its brevity was inversely proportional to its impact. The tech and finance press understood immediately what it meant. Not just that Viridian had received major funding, but that the funding had come from somewhere, and that somewhere had recently been in the orbit of Nexicor. The dots were not difficult to connect. Within 12 hours, a business journalist named Carla Mendez had published a piece that named the incident at the Nexicor boardroom meeting. Her sources were inside the building, and they were, apparently, numerous. The story, as she told it, was precise, unsentimental, and accurate. A prospective investor of significant means had attended a critical funding meeting, had been publicly dismissed on the basis of appearance, and had withdrawn his commitment. The headline was, "How Nexicor Lost $200 million in less than 1 minute." The piece traveled fast, not because it was sensational. It was not written sensationally, but because it was recognizable. Every person who had ever been underestimated in a professional context, every person who had ever been prejudged by the cut of their clothes or the age of their car, every assistant who had ever been invisible at a meeting they helped organize, they all encountered that story and felt it in the particular way that recognition feels, like seeing your own reflection in a window you didn't know was there. By Wednesday afternoon, Victoria Caldwell's name was being searched at a rate that the company's communications team described, in an emergency call, as unprecedented. By Thursday, the board had called a special session. By Friday, 2 senior directors had publicly announced their resignation. A company that had been under financial pressure was now under financial pressure and a reputational crisis simultaneously, which is roughly equivalent to trying to bail out a boat while it's also on fire. Victoria sat through the board session on Thursday with the composed expression of someone who has decided that composure is the last form of dignity available to her. She did not cry. She did not deflect. She answered questions in complete sentences and acknowledged, for the first time publicly, that she had made a poor judgment call. The board was not satisfied by composed acknowledgement. They wanted a plan, a pivot, a restructuring that would stop the hemorrhage. They wanted evidence that the leadership of the company was equal to the moment. One board member, a silver-haired woman named Dr. Patricia Moore, leaned forward at the end of the session and said, "Victoria, you didn't lose us a single investor. You lost us the confidence of every investor who is now watching to see what we do next. You didn't make a tactical error. You made a cultural statement, and cultures are extremely difficult to unfute once they've been seen." The silence after that sentence was the kind that does not invite response. There is a specific texture to the isolation that follows public failure. It is not the same as loneliness, which can at least be traced to absence. It is more precise than that. It is the experience of presence without warmth, of being surrounded by people who are calculating the distance between themselves and you. Victoria had built her professional life inside a structure of deference and proximity, and she now watched, with a clarity she had never previously been afforded, as the structure dissolved. People who had sought her company now sought other company. Invitations stopped. Calls went to voicemail. The lunches and dinners and industry events that had populated her calendar thinned to a sparse landscape of obligations. Her phone was still busy with lawyers, with advisors, with journalists whose calls she did not return, but the specific human frequency of people who simply wanted to be in her vicinity had gone almost entirely silent. She began losing sleep. Not the anxious sleeplessness of pressure, which she had always managed by converting anxiety into preparation. This was different, a kind of blank wakefulness in the deep hours of the night, in which the thoughts that arrived were not strategic but personal. She found herself returning, repeatedly, to her childhood, to Millfield, to the superintendent's office where she had applied for the scholarship that would change her life, wearing her best clothes, which were not very good, to the particular shame of being looked at and found wanting. She had spent 20 years building armor against that experience. And the armor had not failed. What had happened was stranger than failure. The armor had become the weapon. She had done, with precision and power, the exact thing that had been done to her. She had looked at a person and dismissed them based on the surface. And in doing so, she had dismissed herself. It was 3 a.m. on a Thursday when she watched the video for the first time. Sophie had sent it to her without comment, a clip from the boardroom security camera, 53 seconds long. Victoria watched herself. She watched the hand extended across the marble. She watched her own eyes move to it and away. She watched the nod. She watched the laughter at the end of the table, more visible on camera than it had seemed in the moment, more naked, more unkind. She watched Martin Webb sit down, and she watched his face in the moment after the hand was refused. Not wounded, not angry. Simply observant, as if he had just been given information he had been looking for and had found it, and the finding was sad but not surprising. She watched it 4 times. Then she set her phone down and stared at the ceiling of her apartment, her expensive, beautifully decorated apartment that said everything she had wanted to say about who she had become, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt the full weight of who she actually was. Sophie had been working late the following week, long after the office had emptied, when Victoria appeared in the doorway. She was in her usual work clothes, but without the usual architecture of composed authority. Just a woman in a very well-tailored blazer who looked, for the first time Sophie could remember, tired in the way that goes all the way down. Victoria said, "I need to say something to you." Sophie waited. "I've been watching the way you've handled these past 2 weeks," Victoria said. "You've been calm, and thorough, and kind to everyone, including me, especially me. I don't think I've earned that." Sophie chose her words with the care of someone who knows they're holding something fragile. "You haven't failed because you're not talented," Sophie said. "You failed because you convinced yourself that being talented was enough, that you didn't have to be decent on top of it." Victoria looked at her for a long time. Then she said, "I need to go see him." Sophie didn't ask who. She knew exactly who. Martin Webb's office was not what Victoria expected, and the fact that she had expected something, the gleaming tower, the intimidating view, the lobby full of evidence of consequence, told her something about herself she wasn't ready to examine at full length. The converted brick building, the coffee smell, the ordinary hallway, with its ordinary door. She stood outside it for a moment before knocking. She had not brought her chief of staff. She had not brought legal counsel. She had not even brought Sophie. She had come alone, in her own car, which was not a modest car, but which she had driven herself. And she had stood in the parking lot for 4 minutes before walking to the door. Martin Webb received her in a small conference room that had a window overlooking a courtyard with a tree in it. The tree was ordinary. Everything was ordinary. She sat across from him at a table that was not marble, and the absence of marble had never felt so significant. She did not preamble. She said, "I'm here to apologize. Not as a business strategy. Not to reopen a negotiation. To say directly to you that what I did was wrong." Martin looked at her without expression for a moment. Then he said, "Tell me what you think you did wrong." She held his gaze. "I looked at how you presented yourself, and I decided before you spoke that you weren't worth my respect. And I let that show in front of other people, and I let them follow my lead." She paused. "I knew what it felt like to be dismissed that way. I grew up that way. I swore I would never be the person who did it to someone else. And then I became exactly that person without noticing." Martin was quiet for a while. Outside the window, a bird moved through the courtyard tree and was gone. He said, "Wealth doesn't create character. It amplifies what's already there. You were building something your whole life, and you didn't notice that one of the things you were building was contempt." She said, "I know." He said, "The person who extended that hand to you is the same person who built $14 billion in value for the companies he believed in, and you chose, in 45 seconds, to be the kind of leader who can't see that." Victoria said, "I know that too." Then she asked, quietly, the question she had not fully decided to ask until this moment. "Is there any possibility you would reconsider?" Martin looked at her without unkindness and without apology. He said, "No." She nodded, once. And he continued, "But I want to tell you something that I mean genuinely. The woman sitting in this room right now is more impressive than the one in that boardroom. Not because you're apologizing, because you're seeing clearly. That's genuinely rare." He leaned back slightly. "I hope it stays." Victoria stood, and for the first time in years, she did not arrange her face for the camera that wasn't there. She simply looked at him and said, "Thank you." She meant it. She walked out of the building and stood in the parking lot under the ordinary sky, and breathed the ordinary air. And she felt, underneath all the loss and exhaustion and grief, something she had not felt in a long time, the strange, uncomfortable, necessary sensation of being honest with herself. The board voted to remove Victoria Caldwell as CEO of Nexacor Digital Solutions on a Wednesday afternoon, by a margin of 9-3. The announcement was made in a brief press release that used the language of transition and new direction, and said nothing directly about the events of the previous 6 weeks. The stock price fell another 4% on the news, then stabilized. 2 weeks later, Nexacor entered a restructuring process that the financial press covered with the particular blend of clinical analysis and barely concealed appetite that financial journalism reserves for visible corporate collapses. The company would survive diminished, restructured, hollowed in certain ways, but it would survive. Victoria did not. Not the version of her that had sat at the head of that marble table. She cleaned out her office on a Thursday morning, alone. Not because she had been asked to be alone, but because she had declined all offers of assistance. She had 43 personal items on the shelves and surfaces of her office awards. Framed covers from business publications. A small sculpture she had bought in Milan. 3 photographs, and she placed them into 2 boxes, with the methodical calm of a person who has run out of the energy required for pretense. The last thing she removed was a small framed quote she had placed on the wall behind her desk 6 years earlier, when she had first occupied the office. The quote was from a business leader she had admired. "Lead from the front." She wrapped it in paper and put it in the box and did not unwrap it again for a year. She took the elevator down to the ground floor, carried the boxes through the lobby past the security desk, where the guard, a man named Aaron, who had worked the morning shift for 4 years and greeted her every day, and was greeted in return with the precise nod that was apparently her standard register for people she did not need to impress, held the door for her without being asked. She stopped. She set one box down on the floor. She said, "Aaron, I'm sorry I never really talked to you." He looked at her, surprised. He said, "You always seemed very busy, Miss Caldwell." She said, "I was. But that wasn't why." He nodded, slowly. The way people nod when they understand more than what's being said. She picked up the box and walked to her car. She sat in it for 3 minutes, not crying, not thinking, just sitting. Then she drove away. On the sidewalk outside the Nexicor Tower, a woman walking past paused and looked up at the silver arrow on the building's facade, the logo still pointing upward, still frozen in its eternal optimism. She looked at it for a moment, shrugged slightly, and continued walking. The arrow went on pointing. Buildings are patient with their symbols. A year and 4 months later, on a cool November morning, a regional business conference was held in a mid-sized convention center in the same city. It was not a prestigious conference, not the kind with celebrity keynotes and branded water bottles. It was the kind of conference that smaller companies and emerging leaders attended because the ticket price was reasonable and the conversations were unaffected. Victoria Caldwell was there because she had been asked to speak on a panel about organizational culture. And she had said yes because it was the kind of invitation she would have dismissed 12 months ago, and dismissing it now felt like a step backward. She was running a company now. A genuine company, not a hobby, with 64 employees and a product in the workforce analytics space that she had built with a co-founder named James, who was 28 and had once been a junior analyst at Nexicor and had, during the restructuring, called her to ask if she wanted to build something together. She had said yes before he finished the sentence. The company was called Candor Analytics. The name had been her suggestion. She was standing at the coffee station between panel sessions, talking to a founder from an adjacent industry about retention strategy, when she saw him. He was 20 feet away, near the window, speaking with a small group of attendees. He looked exactly the same. Navy blazer, practical shoes, silver in his hair. He hadn't seen her yet. She could have walked the other direction. The possibility was genuinely available to her for a full 4 seconds, and she did not take it. She excused herself from her conversation, walked across the room, and when Martin Webb looked up and recognized her, she extended her right hand. She extended it fully, openly, in the grammar of professional greeting with no calculation behind it, no strategy, no residue of the woman who had once decided 45 seconds was enough time to know another person's worth. He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. And then Martin Webb smiled, not the smile of victory or satisfaction, but the quiet smile of a person who has seen something he hoped to see and had not been certain he would. He took her hand and shook it. Firm. Brief. Complete. She said. "How are you?" He said. "Better question. How are you?" And she told him honestly. They spoke for 11 minutes. Nothing transformative was discussed. No deal was made. No second chance was extended or requested. They talked about the conference, about organizational culture, about a book they had both recently read. They talked the way two professionals talk when they are simply being decent to each other, in a space where decency is available and sufficient. When they parted, there was no drama, no cinematic wait, just two people walking in different directions after a conversation that cost nothing, and, in its own quiet way, resolved something. Victoria walked back toward the panel room. Through the tall windows of the convention center, the November sky was a flat, clear gray, the particular gray of late autumn that carries no promise and no threat. Only the simple fact of the present day. She thought about Aaron, the security guard. She thought about Sophie, who now led people operations at a company she had founded herself and was doing exceptionally well. She thought about her 64 employees, most of whose names she knew, all of whose faces she recognized, several of whom she had made a deliberate practice of checking in with, simply because they were there, and she was there, and the distance between people is almost always smaller than we pretend. She did not think about the marble table. She did not think about the arrow. She walked into the panel room, sat down at the long table beside 4 other panelists, adjusted the microphone, and answered the first question clearly and without performance. The question was about leadership. The answer, if you were listening closely, was about everything that comes after the moment you finally decide to stop being the person you were afraid of becoming. There is an old and unfashionable idea that the most important room you will ever walk into is not the one with the highest floor number or the most expensive table. It is simply the next one, and what you carry into it, not your title, not your portfolio, not the make of your car or the cut of your jacket, but what you carry in the way you extend your hand to a stranger, in the second between looking at someone and deciding what they're worth. That is the whole of it. That is everything. A company can survive on capital. A career can be rebuilt from humility. But a person is only ever made of the accumulated weight of how they have treated other people, in every room, at every table, in every moment when the stakes seemed too low to bother being decent. Victoria Caldwell had learned this at a cost that would have broken someone with a smaller capacity for honesty. She carried it with her now, not as a wound and not as a trophy, but simply as knowledge, the kind that changes the shape of every room you enter from the inside out.